Welcome, everybody. This is Annalisa Durr with Journey to the Goddess TV, where I like to regenerate ancient feminine wisdom for modern women. Today, I have a full panel. I am so excited to be here with 3 guests, and the guest of honor, Dr. Carla Ionescu. Dr. Carla is a Romanian refugee who escaped the communist regime with her family when she was 10 years old. Her research centers on the influential nature of the goddess Artemis and the reconstruction of women's rituals from the ancient world. Dr. Ionescu's recent book, She Who Hunts: How Artemis Changed the World, provides evidence which suggests that Artemis is the most prevalent and influential goddess of the Mediterranean. As one of the leading experts in the worship and ritual of Artemis Ephesia, Dr. Ionescu spends most of her time teaching in the field of ancient history and women's studies, and/or applying for grants to support her research travels. When she's not teaching, Carla spends time climbing mountains, befriends goats, and telling ancient stories. She also likes to ride motorcycles real fast and research through archival documents very carefully. In the summers, she scavenged new locations and cities worldwide, digging through the remains of grave sites, ruins, and abandoned buildings, trying to uncover the long-lost mystery that is Artemis, the Great Mother. Ooh, great bio there. Welcome, officially.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So Dr. Carla is going to be giving us a presentation today, and then we'll be doing a Q&A discussion. And I have 2 guests joining me to grill her, if you will, not so much grill, but be asking the questions. I have Dr. Courtney Kleftis. Hi, Dr. Courtney. Courtney is a queer librarian living and working in southern Maine with her wife and adorable cat, Mofeta, Spanish for skunk. When not at work, Courtney is a fierce devotee of the goddess and is eager to relaunch the Goddess Foundation, established 2020, as a bi-monthly blog and podcast in which she will provide resources for anyone and everyone interested in exploring the goddess path. Courtney also enjoys belly dancing, walks on the beach, hiking, reading, mostly fantasy and historical fiction, and has begun writing a seminal autobiographical novel about her complex relationship with Ariadne and Dionysus, or Dionysus, as I learned is his name pronounced in Greek. And then finally, but not least, I have a doctoral candidate, the almost doctor, Roz Carlos. Oh no, Roz. I have Courtney's bio posted here twice.
What can I say? I like to double myself as much as possible. Just to start.
Okay. Rosalind Carlos, MA, is a mythologist, mixed media artist, and jewelry designer using unconventional materials. She has an interest in the creative interplay between the conscious and unconscious minds, how that relationship influences the way people experience the world, and how they act in accordance with those experiences. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. I want to remind everybody watching to like this video, share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear your thoughts and your comments. This is sure to be a very fascinating conversation.
Hello all, and welcome to this presentation of Artemis at Brauron. I'm very, very excited to share Artemis with everyone, but Artemis at Brauron is one of my most magical spaces, and I hesitate to use that word in an academic setting, but it is magical because it has so much meaning to me, but also because it really went unknown, unresearched, undiscovered for a very, very long time, and then it sort of just happened. And so there's something really amazing about it. This QR code that you see here is for the Artemis Center. So the Artemis Center is a virtual center right now that I've started in honor of the goddess Artemis. It has a bunch of my courses on there that I'm running, and I hope to be able to do goddess travel on there as well, so we can go and visit some of the Artemis sites together. So these would be sort of academic, archaeological, but also adventure tours that I would like to do. And that came out of my love for solo travel and for hiking mountains and talking to goats. So if you'd like to know what's happening with the Artemis Center, and eventually I would like to have a real physical brick and mortar Artemis Center in Crete, in Greece on the island of Crete. And there we will do everything from, again, courses to travel to retreats and I would really love to have an actual temple to her, because I think it's time that we rebuild the temples to the ancient gods. And I feel particularly called to rebuild a site for her to be worshipped. Perhaps not in the way that we're going to talk about the worships at Brauron and the rites at Brauron, but a site where people can come and pay their respects nonetheless, And so that is the goal. That requires some additional funding and a lot of other work, but it's a work that's beginning. So if you'd like to know about that, more news, or there's a newsletter that I do, maybe I want to say a few times a year. I don't want to commit too much, but so if you would like to sign up, that's the QR code for it. Then this is my book that you mentioned, Annalise, earlier, She Who Hunts. It is the first book in what I hope to be a 6-book series. And so this book deals with the Greek goddess Artemis, which of course is going to be part of our talk today because Brauron is just outside of Athens in Greece. I have several other books in the works. So for example, the book that I'm working on now is Artemis of Ephesus, and I would like to have that come out in spring. And then next summer, I plan to go to Eastern Europe and look for Artemis Bendis, who is an adaptation of a more ancient Thracian, perhaps even other Balkan and Dacian and other tribes that were in Eastern Europe. They have a hunter goddess that is very much Artemis as well. So there's not a lot of research done on her. And so that will be sort of the third book. And then there's an Artemis of Sicily in the works. And maybe I will get to Diana at some point down the road. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. And so this book is the first one. And I thought it was the best way to introduce her as the Greek Artemis, because I think most people are familiar with her in the Greek version, which is the hunter goddess, the twin sister of Apollo, the goddess of childbirth, fertility, those kinds of things. And so as one of the Olympians, people are more familiar with her as one of the Olympians. However, in this book, of course, I touch on Brauron in depth in this book as well. But what I've done here that I think has not been made available previously is that I've covered much of her worship in Greece, some of her history. So where does Artemis come from? Because Artemis is not a Greek word and it's not a Greek name. Where does Artemis come from? What might have been her sort of ancestral divinities from which she borrows, from which she adapts? So there's all that kind of that conversation in the book that is difficult to find even today. People have ignored her a little bit, and by people I mean scholars have ignored her, which works for me because, as you all know, as a PhD student, you need to find a topic that has not been done before or not done in detail. And so for my PhD thesis, I did sort of a long trace of the pre-Greek Artemis to the Greek Artemis to the Ephesian Artemis, the Virgin Mary. And that was sort of the trajectory of my PhD thesis, which was a much larger project. But what I'd like to do now is focus more specifically, plus add some of the new research, that kind of stuff. So this is the beginning. Also, one of the things that I've done with this book is I self-published this work. One of the things that I'm finding challenging is finding a academic publisher that fits my vision. So they want me to fit their vision. And I think that time is over, although I know academics are all going to look at me and go, what are you talking about? But I think that time is over. And also, so I've shopped it around and people wanted different things and they wanted me to wait 3 to 5 years and they had all the sort of changes they wanted to make. And I thought, you know what, it's time that I do this by myself, which is stepping a little bit outside of the academic world. And also because my audience is mostly non-academics, to be fair. It's just people who are interested in ancient worship, goddess worship. And there's lots of Artemis worshipers that I didn't even know existed before I published this book. And so they're really interested. And so this book allows them to connect. So to have primary source, to have referencing, to have sort of an academic angle, because that's just who I am, but also that it's digestible, not very long, it, you know, it has, I mean, now I'm bragging about it sort of humbly, but right, it's enjoyable in a way that perhaps some academic texts don't care to be that enjoyable, because they're more interested in, you know, the research and the data, which is also fair. There's a time and place for that. So I'm excited to publish it on my own, and the reaction to it has been quite awesome, in the sense of, like, people are really interested in the goddess that I did not know that they were quite as interested in her as I am. So without further ado, let's talk about the sanctuary at Brauron. So these are my own pictures that I'm sharing with you guys. Much of the writing here is just referencing the pictures and the museum inscription. So please, you don't need to know anything or take notes on anything. It's just, you know, that is a little bit of my own academic background of referencing everything. So this is the site at Brauron. Well, this is much of the site at Brauron. There is a museum that is just a little bit to my right of here. It's a small museum. And this site that we see here is built around 5th century BCE, and then sort of rebuilt upon that by the Romans later, and then destroyed. And this is the site that sort of goes undetected for a very, very long time. Now, you can't see here because the water has receded, but we'll look at the little bit of the sacred river in a minute. But there used to be water. There is water, but it's about 2 kilometers away, that came right up to the temple. And so it was on a port, and lots of people visited this temple. It is one of the most famous temples for Artemis, and it is connected to the temple for her on the Acropolis in Athens. Now, I don't know if you've been to the Acropolis in Athens, but no one really knows that at the bottom of the Acropolis, I'm very bad with directions, but as you step down from the Acropolis, on one of the sides, there is a small temple to Artemis. And this space is where the procession would begin for Artemis of Brauron every 4 years. So they would start from the small Artemis temple there and walk their way to Brauron. So it's about a 2-hour drive from Athens. So I don't know what that walk would have been like, but maybe at least a day, if not 2, depending on how slow and how. So they did this procession every 4 years for her. And there is this myth that Orestes came down to this site with a statue of Artemis Tauropolis, or the Taurian Artemis, and established this cult here at Brauron. And then he moved on later on with the same statue and went down to Sparta and sort of took that there. There is also, as we'll talk about, a site for IPHIGENIA's tomb at this site, which is really mysterious. Yeah, it's very, very... IPHIGENIA is a really interesting character in Artemis's life and in Artemis's mythology, but the very fact that they have a short little sanctuary to her and then the tomb where she's said to be buried here, that's just extremely significant. And so this, what we have here, what we have remaining here, are a mix between the earliest is 5th, 6th century BCE, and then some of the Roman period. So we'll go over it. Let me see, we'll go over it. What you see here is the Great Portico, which is the outside. This is where people were asked to come in and wait. There is an interesting local legend that there are 40 of these columns, and that this represents the length of a woman's pregnancy, although we know, women's pregnancy tends to take 36 weeks, but between 36 and 38 weeks. And there's a local legend by midwives that these represent the birthing months of women, and that pregnant women would walk through these halls, and pray to Artemis and make their offerings. And so there's something mystical about this site. I should say that this site was first discovered, I guess, and began to be dug up. The words are escaping me right now, by a man named Papadimitriou. So Ioannis Papadimitriou. But as he was digging through the site and uncovering it, and that was between 1949 and 1963, he died of a heart attack. And when he died of a heart attack, the whole site sort of remained half uncovered, let's say. And it really wasn't rediscovered until the late 1970s, 1980s. And so the first time that I ever went to the site, it was maybe 10, 15 years ago now, I went on a trip with my mother, sort of like a mother-daughter trip. And we were in all over Greece, Rome, Turkey. We went away for 6 weeks. But I really wanted to see this site. And it wasn't in any of the guidebooks, and it wasn't anywhere. And so I asked somebody in Athens who was with us, and they said, oh yeah, I think it's like just a couple of kilometers outside of Athens. And so I dragged my mother with me. We took the subway, we took the bus, we get to Brauron, which is also called Ravona in Greece. And we get there and we're like, okay, so where is the site? And no one knows what we're talking about. And eventually we find somebody who goes, oh yeah, it's just like a couple of kilometers that way, just go that way. And it's of course, it's in the middle of June. It's hot as heck. My poor mother, is 60 something years old. So I go, okay, let's just walk. So we walk a couple of kilometers, nothing. We hit a fruit stand. Hey, have you seen Artemis of Verona? My broken ancient Greek, right? Which they kind of look at me sometimes like, what are you saying? So they're like, oh yeah, I think so. I think it's like a couple of more kilometers that way, right? So we walk another couple of more kilometers, and finally we begin to see part of this. You could see part of this from the road. And there's a woman that's guarding the site who sees me and my mother coming in the middle of this heat, almost dying of heat. So she has water bottles, in her little kiosk, and gives my mother a chair, gives her a water bottle. What are you doing? What are you doing here in the middle of the day? I'm like, oh, we're looking for this place, blah, blah. Then I say to her, I know that there's a museum around here because I know they have a lot of discoveries that they found. And she looks at me, she goes, yeah, it's just like a couple of kilometers down that road. And she wasn't wrong. Like, I don't know why the museum is on the other end of the site. The site is quite large. And when I walked into the museum, there was no one in it. There was 2 kids making out in the booth behind where you get your ticket. And when I walk in the museum, they kind of jumped. They were like, oh my God, someone is here. And then I proceeded to go in the museum and take pictures of like every single thing. And so they kind of eyed me a little bit like, what is this girl doing here? And so interestingly, I don't have very many pictures of the first ones that I took. However, I did go back just this January to the site with a friend, and it was a little more populated, and actually they changed some stuff around. So it's easier to access and all that kind of fun stuff. So this here that you see, so I took pictures of everything, but I'm just going to share with you a few pictures. This here that you see is the foundation of the actual temple to Artemis, the sanctuary itself. This is the space that only priestesses and young women were allowed to enter. As you can see here, this is just the foundation, and this would have been the massive sort of construction here. The entrance is on this side over here. This here is a church. There seems to be a church placed at every doorway and every temple in Greece. I consider that sort of the patriarchy, marking their territory. Oh, we don't believe in these pagan gods, but let's just stick a church on there just in case. It's not actually a working church anymore, but it was apparently a working church up until like the 1800s. And so now it's just there for decoration. This is the bridge. As you can see, there's a bridge here. So because this was right near water, there used to be a really large river, a sacred river and a sacred pool. They called it sacred and thought it was sacred, that would run under this bridge and run right up to the temple of Artemis. And this water was used for libation rites, purification rites, bathing of young women, especially as they practiced the Arkteia and other rituals that they were doing. I think I have a better view of this. So this is what remains. So here is the temple of Artemis. Here's the one corner. And you can see here kind of what remains of the water. It's difficult to imagine how much, there's no water running under this bridge anymore, but it's difficult to imagine how much water was here. So there's a lot of water imagery and water ritual that go on, that are around this temple. But right now, when you're walking on it, it's very dry and it seems very flat, and it doesn't really have the magnificence it would have had in the ancient world. However, the sacred pool and the sacred river are important aspects. And what's really, really amazing about it is that historians believe that this spot was a site of worship even in Neolithic times. So we can go back to like 9th century BCE and perhaps before, because this valley where the temple is in between two small mountains, small hills, mountainous hills, and the water came right up. And so there is this tradition that there's something beautiful and there's like an energy here that is sacred. And so historians now believe that this was a site that has prehistoric habitation or marks of prehistoric habitations. And the sacred pool, of course, the sacred spring, is a major part of that, of the ritual practices around sacred purifications. So these are some of the figures. I like this one particularly because it's one of the oldest of the figures that we found, and it is bronze. And what scholars or archaeologists believe is that it used to cover a piece of wood. So in the very initial stages of most Mediterranean god worship, pre-Greek worship, let's say, gods were worshipped just as a piece of wood, right? So you would just have a piece of wood. It didn't even, in the beginning, it didn't even have any human characteristics. It would just be a piece of wood. And there are some stories that the piece of wood itself was inhabited by the god while the ritual was going on. And so there are stories, local stories of sort of shamanic abilities for priestesses to call in the goddess into the wood. And they would do things like washing the wood every year, walk around the wood every year. They would sometimes bathe the wood in blood, bull blood, often bull blood, especially here at Brauron because of the tradition of Artemis Tauropolis, which is Artemis the bull. And so the belief around this piece is that this piece was actually stuck on a piece of wood, but of course none of the wood made it through. We have very little. We have like maybe 1 or 2 pieces of wood that have survived, and they're very difficult to tell what do they represent. And so this is really one of the oldest pieces in the museum that was found there. So 7th century BCE, and of course it is thought to be a representation of Artemis. We then have, of course, other marble representations of Artemis. What's really fascinating, well, there's a couple of things that's really fascinating. The face of the goddess is different. Her hairstyle is different. The dress is different. And they're all about 4th century BCE, 5th century BCE. So one of the things that comes up as a question is, how did ancient Greeks, let's say, or classical Greeks in this case, how did they interpret the goddess's visualization? And you can see this one is headless, but has this really cool dress that I think anybody could probably wear today, with the crisscross leather from her bow and arrow. On top of her head, you can see here, there are holes that we know had some kind of bronze antennae, bronze something. I'm going to show you what scholars think about a couple of them. So we don't know exactly what they were, but she did carry some kind of a headdress on her head, which is also really fascinating. So we have several depictions of Artemis at Brauron. We also have, of course, depictions of her sitting with animals. These are 3 of my favorites, but they're numerous. In fact, they say that they found thousands and thousands of figurines. So the museum, which is one of my sort of pet peeves with museum, is that they have them all in the back room in drawers, right? And I know that they might say, well, you know, if you've seen one Artemis with a deer, you've probably seen them all. But I would really like to see them all. Like, you know, I would like a wall or a room where they're just displayed and you could just walk around and see them. I don't know, but that's just me because I'm obsessed. But so I've given you 3 options here, with a lion, a deer, and another deer. So this tells us that ironically, Artemis at Brauron is associated with bears. And the young women that came here for ritual are called she-bears. And yet there is not one image with a bear. Not one. Not one image of the goddess as a bear. Not one image of the goddess carrying a bear. Not one image of anything to do with bears, which is a mystery to me. And I plan to go back, well, probably multiple times, and ask around as to why. what is this? How is this possible? How is it possible? And so we have a lot of Artemis with deer. Deer is one of her animals. She both hunts deers and protects deers. So she really stands on that. She balances that life and death threshold. And lions are interesting because lions are not local to this area. However, this points us to other an inheritance from perhaps a previous time and other places. So, but there are a couple of images with her and lions. This might also connect us to Cybele. Cybele is a goddess that has two lions always with her, and she sits often on a throne and has the two lions on either side. So the fact that we have some Artemision depictions with lions, there may be some connection there or correlation there, but there's no straight line, so it's a little bit uncertain. However, lions, for those that don't know, represent things like royalty, monarchy, wealth, power. Lions are often associated with that, while deer are associated with nature, motherhood. Often deer are herd animals and they are prey animals, so there's something soft about deer and magical about deer. And she is often associated with deer. She's also associated with Patniatheron, which is the mistress of animals. No surprise there, as she is often seen as the goddess of the wild or a goddess of animals. You can see here, these are some of her hunting poses. And so you can see that she's pulling a quiver or carrying a quiver. She's got dogs at her side. And she also carries a torch. So Artemis is also Phosphorus, which is the light bringer, light carrier, torch carrier, which are part of her chthonic aspects, which means she is a goddess of life and death, or a goddess of the underworld. Normally, when we think of chthonic goddesses in the Olympian pantheon, we think of Hekate and we think of Persephone. Those are the two. However, recently, I've discovered that Artemis is the third, which is really, really fascinating, because no one talks about Artemis as light bringer, as Lucifera, and I've seen her carrying more torches everywhere I go now. Now that I've noticed her carrying torches more and more, I find her carrying torches all the time. This is an image that I find really fascinating, which is the sacred family. So we've got Zeus here, we've got Leto, who you can't see, unfortunately, her face. We've got Apollo, and we've got Artemis. She may be carrying a sphere here, it's unknown. And in the further corner of this image, there is a little head that scholars think is IPHIGENIA. And so while we think about the Olympians as Zeus, Hera, I don't know, Ares, and the others, Athena often always plays an important role. One of the most interesting and most powerful pieces here is this family. This seems to be a family of power. And so Zeus, obviously, we know who he is. Apollo is also the most favorite of all Olympians, and of course, the most favorite of Zeus. Leto is a really fascinating figure. She is persecuted while she's pregnant with the twins by Hera, but also she never finds a place to give birth until she reaches Delos, and people keep kicking her out of their villages and their towns, and they don't want to have nothing to do with her. And so this is very reminiscent of the Virgin Mary when she's looking to give birth to Jesus and no one is giving them space at the inn. And everybody's kind of shunning her because they're afraid of Hera, blah, blah. And then once she gives birth at Delos, well, Artemis is born first, fully grown, and she helps give birth to Apollo. But after their birth, when their mother is safe, Artemis and Apollo famously go back to many of the kings and princes and villages that denied their mother and either cursed them, killed them, or punished them. So that's one of my favorite stories of the sacred family. Artemis is very protective of her mother. In fact, she kills a lot of people for her mother, and she kills Niobe's 14 children, her and Apollo, when Niobe dares to say that her children are better looking than even the children of Leto or Leda. And Artemis, yeah, she doesn't play when it comes to her mama. Let me just tell you, you don't offend Leto without death. And so they go and they kill the children of Niobe together. And so this image is really, really powerful because it's one of the rarest pieces we've seen, and it has all four. And my favorite is that Zeus seems to have a very sort of marginalized position here. And clearly Artemis is the powerhouse here. I mean, Apollo's looking at her. She's, She's walking around. The only thing that's interesting is that we don't know what was in her hands, but people go, oh, it was bow and arrow or a spear, perhaps a torch. Who can say? Yeah. Then there are just a few images of Artemis Tauropolos, and this has to do with Orestes coming and bringing her over. Artemis Tauropolos is a really interesting figure. She's a really bloodthirsty figure. She's associated with the bull because there were so many bulls sacrificed to her. And there's a lot of, she's really bloodthirsty. So her worship includes things like washing her altar with blood, soaking her image with blood, bull blood. Although there are stories that originally it was human sacrifice, which is really even more interesting. But the bull aspect plays a key role. However, at Artemis of Brauron, we only have a few pieces of the bull itself. So it's unclear how much of that bull sacrifice took place at this particular site. And then the festival of Arkteia. One of my favorite festivals of Artemis is this festival of Arkteia. So young women were Arktoi or Arkteias. And so basically what happened, in short, what happened at this ritual is young women of 10, 11, 12 years old were called wild women, wild young girls, would come to the temple of Brauron, where they would go through a ritual of initiation, where they would move from the wildness of childhood into young adulthood, ready for marriage. So it's a little heartbreaking in some ways, because part of the ritual is that they wear these yellow saffron dresses or wraps, and that they dance around the altar. And as they dance around the altar, they shed the yellow saffron wraps. And in that shedding and that sort of leaving behind their childhood ways, they become initiated into young adulthood and ready for marriage. So some people interpret it as offering their wildness for the goddess. Okay. Some people have interpreted it as giving up that wildness in order to fit into patriarchy, which seems to be the truth of certainly classical Greek and on practice of this initiation. Some people argue that this is part of an older tradition in which young women came to dance for Artemis and represent their wildness without having to give it up. So there's a lot of debate around what happens to young women's wildness, and what role does Artemis play in it? Is she the protector? Of course, then Artemis plays a key role in protecting them in their marriage, protecting them in childbirth, and all the other phases of a woman's life at this time. My favorite aspect, though, and probably one of the aspects that I would like to resurrect in a way and revive, is the fact that we do not have any more rituals for young women as they come of age, right? We don't, so public rituals is what I mean. The only public rituals we have for women today is marriage, is a wedding. There's not even, I mean, maybe the baby shower might be another public ritual. I don't know. But a lot of that is sort of the usefulness of women, so, or the value of women. So we celebrate the wedding as sort of, the now property of masculine or of patriarchy, and then we celebrate the birthing as sort of, well, okay, now you're playing a key role in creation. But none of the youthful rituals that were celebrated for lots of young women, we no longer celebrate them anymore. Or rites of passage for women, we no longer do. So this was a rite of passage for young women at Brauron, and it is one that Brauron is most famous for. So there's lots of authors like Euripides and Aeschylus, oh my god, I can't even say his name now, who have female characters that talk about having shed their saffron robes at Brauron for Artemis as part of their initiation ritual. To be fair, we have no documentation from the site itself of what happened there and how exactly this festival played out. We have secondhand information, and then we have a little bit of fictional information that says that these pieces are part of plays. So they're not actual witness accounts, which we don't have a lot of witness accounts from the ancient world. And we certainly have no, other than Sappho, we have no women who participate in any of these rituals coming forward to write about them or talk about them that we have so far. So a bit of a mystery. There's lots of these pieces all over the museum, and they're basically pieces that are made by families in honor of the goddess Artemis. And they're made, for example, I don't know, if you're wealthy and you wanted her favor, you would represent yourself this way, your family coming to offer something. As you can see here, there's a bull. Here, there's just a deer. Here, there's another bull that's being offered to her. So there's a lot of depictions here of families that are coming to offer something to the goddess, usually some type of a sacrifice, a goat or a bull. And there's many of these plaques. They're they're in a plaque form, and they have a little inscription of which family donated or had it sculpted. And so we have a little more information about the families that came here to worship. But we have a ton of these, which is really interesting because the depiction of Artemis is very unique in all of the images. And I like the fact that she's usually bigger than everybody else. So there's this automatic understanding that she is the divine. And this is the same. So the sacred house of IPHIGENIA. Yeah. So IPHIGENIA, for those of you that might not be familiar, is the best friend slash sister slash, I like to say, lover of Artemis. Artemis has always sort of pushed the gender boundaries, not that there were gender boundaries back in the day, but for classicists especially, the one thing nobody ever talks about is the fact that Artemis has a very close relationship with her entourage. Yeah. And I'm doing a series of episodes for the Goddess Project called The Gay Gods of Greece. And Artemis is on the top of my list. So we're going to talk about all her gayness. Yeah. And IPHIGENIA and Callisto are two of the entourage. I don't know if they're goddesses. Eventually people do call them goddesses, and Callisto, of course, becomes a constellation that plays such a key role in Artemis's mythology. However, having an actual space for IPHIGENIA is fascinating because it is unclear whether IPHIGENIA was a real character. So originally, if anyone sort of read the Iliad, she is the daughter of Agamemnon. Agamemnon offends Artemis by killing one of her deer, and we are told that by Homer that Artemis demands the sacrifice of IPHIGENIA, which is Agamemnon's youngest daughter. And so, of course, Agamemnon, who's kind of a douche, asks IPHIGENIA to come, and under the guise of he's going to marry her off to Achilles, and Clytemnestra sends her daughter off, and IPHIGENIA gets to the front of the army. There's an altar. She's lying down. Her father's above her, about to stab her and sacrifice her in honor of Artemis. And we are told that at the very last minute, Artemis takes IPHIGENIA and replaces her either with a deer or a goat or a bull or whatever. And from that moment on, IPHIGENIA becomes Artemis's constant companion, favorite companion, constant companion, high priestess. There's all these words attached to her. And so for a long time, people thought this was Homeric, storytelling, unclear whether IPHIGENIA really exists. However, at Brauron, we have the sacred house of IPHIGENIA. We don't actually know what happened inside this house or what role took place here. And in the back here, where you can't go in, there is a tomb right behind this space. There is a tomb to IPHIGENIA. And the belief was that she had settled here after she was rescued from her father, and that she was a priestess of Artemis for her whole life, and that when she died, she was buried in that tomb. Of course, there's no human remains in that tomb. Yeah. But again, what's fascinating to me is, what did they do with the tomb? Did they go into the tomb? What did they think of IPHIGENIA? We don't have any of the writings. We don't have anything that really tells us what happened here. We assume that there's probably offerings here, that there's probably libations that happen here. But I mean, that's a pretty basic assumption for most sacred sites. Yeah. I also have a couple examples of Artemis carrying torches. One of the most fascinating things is that she carries two torches sometimes, one torch sometimes, two torches sometimes. And we found a statue of Hekate at the site, also carrying two torches. So again, there's this really interesting connection between Artemis and Hekate. Sometimes they're overlapping, Artemis and Hekate. But here, there's a very clear distinction. And Artemis carries these two torches this way, which is actually a very unique way of carrying torches. I'm not sure that I've seen any other god carry two torches in one hand in this way. But again, we are unclear as to what does this mean. The core of Brauron is one of the rare discoveries that we've seen here. The reason why I bring up this core of Brauron is because she may be because of this relationship between Brauron and Athens. There is a really fascinating statue, another core statue in the Acropolis Museum, this statue here, that is called the Peplos core, or the core of Peplos, or whatever. She was found in the Athenian Acropolis, and she's in the Acropolis Museum today. However, there is some very intense academic and archaeological research that claims that this is what the core of Peplos looks like in the museum, but this has been a redesign and a redrawing based on the remains and what we can see on the actual statue. So we know that there's all these animals on her. They've done all these technological studies to see the colors, to see all of these things. The only things that they're uncertain of is what is she carrying in her hands and what is on the top of her head. So initially they thought that these would be spears. They were kind of placeholders because she has 13 holes in her head. And now they're beginning to see them as the astrological symbols. So there's 11 astrological symbols and the star of Orion. So there's a lot of mystery around this statue. The Met, who did a lot of the Chroma exhibition, which was a lot of the recoloring of the statues, had this entire conference for a weekend that was a lot of fun that I had the chance to go to. And Ulrich Brickman, who is the German scholar that's doing all of this work, and she's also an artist and she does all of this drawing. Her and her husband, Vincent Brickman, who are very significant scholars in the field of archaeology, have come to the conclusion that this may be Artemis Tauropolis, and that she may be wearing a head of constellations, and that has such significant implications. If that is the case, it makes her such a powerful divinity, more powerful, I would argue, than anyone else in the Olympian pantheon. Of course, that's my argument. And so we have been talking a lot. When I went to the conference, we talked a lot about what she's carrying, and I'm arguing with them that she's carrying a torch in one hand. At least she's got to be carrying a torch. But I'm fascinated by the constellations, and I'm glad to see that in the academic world, astrology is starting to become something that they're looking at. Astrology and astronomy is something that they're considering. And so we'll see. So far, the Acropolis Museum has not changed their little inscription that says Kore of Peplos to Artemis Tauropolis, but one can hope. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you.
I would love it too, before we jump into a Q&A, if you have anything else to share around her kind of pre-Olympian roots. Like, what is your maybe theory of her trajectory from pre-classical Artemis to classical Artemis?
So in the book, I cover a lot more in depth than I can even recall right now. So I would say that she comes, so it's a tricky way to trickle down, because she comes for sure from the Pantheon, which is the mistress of animal tradition. And this tradition, this depiction, actually, perhaps not the name, but the depiction, which is a goddess holding out her two hands, and in each hand there's an animal. Sometimes there's like two geese, sometimes it's two deer, sometimes it's two lions. You can find this tradition. I actually had an image that maybe you can share that I just came across that has like 12 of these images across the world. You find it across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, but now they're finding a couple in South America as well. So this tradition of the mistress of animal, there's also a mister of animals, but he's a lot more insignificant, is a Neolithic tradition, I would say, perhaps even earlier. So for sure, she comes out of that tradition, and most scholars lean towards that tradition in Crete, because that's where we have a lot of mistress of animals depictions, and we found a lot of this, but we find it in the Mediterranean as well. But she also leans towards like Egyptian imagery, like Isis, Neith, Hathor, because of her association with cows and bulls, because of her association with birthing and protection of childbirth and fertility. And she also leans towards Anatolian, perhaps even Middle Eastern, Kybele worship. And this, so in Turkey, there's this amalgamation of Cybele worship, Hekate worship, and Artemis of Ephesus worship. So I don't think she has an original place. I think that the Greeks adapted her wherever they went, or they saw a goddess that seemed similar to her in characteristics and went, oh yeah, that's our Artemis. And then of course the Romans turned that into Diana. So I think she has several ancestral lines, is I guess what I'm thinking. And who knows, once I go into Eastern Europe, what might be there. I know, for example, Nordic mythology has a hunter goddess as well, with a bow and arrow, and she has skis, you know. I think her name is Skadi, Skadi. And so there's so much. And so I think that Artemis, the name and the image that we have of her fits really well. So I guess the question should be, why do we have so many hunter goddesses, right? Or goddesses of the wild all over the world? Like, what does that say about that kind of worship that humans were attracted to? And so I think that then Artemis sort of accumulates all of these aspects, or the Greeks and later the Romans take those aspects and go, yeah, that must be our goddess.
Right. And it's actually very likely that there was also like a pre-Greek Mycenaean and probably pre-Mycenaean.
Absolutely.
Pre-Artemis there.
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of like Ariadne, right, which is sort of a Minoan, I mean, Ariadne now, we often think of her with Theseus, and there's all this sort of Greek takeover of the goddess of Crete. But Ariadne, so people go, well, Ariadne might have been a priestess of Artemis. Maybe, but she may have been her own queen. She may have been her own goddess. It's very unclear what role, right, she played. And so I think that the Greeks blended a lot. Well, I know that the Greeks blended a lot. And so now untying that, unthreading that is a task. Yeah.
Okay, so I have lots of questions, but I would like to let my guests ask questions if you have any.
I can go. I have often thought, I haven't dug into the research, so I don't have a lot to substantiate this, but I just feel like there has to be a really profound link between Artemis, a pre-Hellenic Minoan Ariadne, and a pre-Hellenic Maenad cult. Like, do you see any sort of link between those figures, Ariadne, Dionysus's, or maybe Ariadne's Maenads and Artemis? I mean, this might be a big leap, but
no, it's not a leap at all. No, I just did an episode on Maenads and the wild women of Dionysus, and absolutely, I agree with you. I think that there is something about wildness and wild women that Artemis tends to sort of encompass. So her field of work is wild women, but so is Dionysus. And Artemis and Dionysus are sometimes friendly, but they seem to share the same space, right? Because Dionysus is also a god of the woods. He's also a god of the forests. He leans a little more towards like orgiastic, wine drinking, et cetera, and certainly later on he does. But I think that the wild women of Dionysus could easily be linked to the wild entourage of Artemis and traced back to Ariadne, because on Crete, there's at least one temple, and there's at least 4 or 5 caves for the worship of Artemis, which is really interesting, because you don't think of Crete too much as associated with Artemis in classical research. There's really not that much association. But when I've gone there, they have it very clearly labeled. This is a cave of Artemis. This is another cave of Artemis. This is another cave of Artemis. And I'm like, oh my God. And so, yeah, I think that there is, I don't know what the connection between Ariadne and Artemis are, in the sense of the evidence that we have doesn't show, there's no mythology around that per se. Like Ariadne is abandoned by Theseus, and Ariadne is the daughter of Minos. So Artemis isn't really involved in there as far as the mythology, but yet she's so much on Crete that I've often asked this question: why and how? The answer tends to be a little ambiguous, but it could be the wildness of it all. That could be a key, because there are sacred mountains in Crete, there are sacred forests in Crete. It would make sense that once the Mycenaeans and the Greeks showed up there, established themselves there, that they would have given the wild to this goddess, that they would have been like, oh yeah, of course, Artemis would be here where the wildness is. And then they make Ariadne into this young girl that is, left behind by Theseus. Well, I think Ariadne is a very powerful priestess, right? A very powerful entity. And I really think Ariadne is starting to come into her own. There's more interest in her now than ever. And so that's just really exciting. Yeah.
There's a great book about her by Jennifer Saint.
I love that book. I read that book. Yes. Fantastic book. Fantastic. I mean, there's another great book of her by Zenobia Neal, where she's a little more aggressive and a little more gay, which I love. Yeah. I mean, and she's a little more tougher. And then there's a couple of books, where she's, I guess for me, I would like her to be less associated with Theseus.
Me too.
I don't mind a bit of the focus with Dionysus. I really enjoyed that part of the book. But yeah, I would like her to be a bit of a more like stronger figure. But we're piecing her together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were talking about Ariadne and Artemis. I was thinking about how you talked about how Artemis is so connected with all of these horned animals, goats, bulls, deer. Is it possible there's a connection between Ariadne and Artemis through the Minotaur?
Oh, I love this question. So if there's an association around horns, you're absolutely right. There seems to be an association around horns and antlers. And later on, like even in Celtic mythology and other mythologies, there's these antler goddesses or deer goddesses, and in Northern Europe also. So I think that's a great point. There is a scholar named Laura Perry, who is an expert in Minoan traditions, but particularly in Minoan worship. And her work talks about how the Minotaur may have originally been one of the gods of the Minoans, and that the conquest of Theseus, of the Minotaur, is the conquest of the Mycenaeans and then the Hellenians over Minoan culture. That would mean then that Ariadne and the Minotaur may be powerful divinities of a pre-Greek culture. And the tie-in to Artemis then would be something similar in the sense that because she's associated with bulls and goats and deer, again, it makes sense that the only goddess of the Greeks at that time that fit here would have been Artemis. I can't think of any of the others, like, Hera, Athena, Demeter. And ironically, actually, Dionysus is also sometimes represented as a horned god, and he has horns. And so you may be right that there is an association. Now, one of the things that Laura Perry told me, I did an interview with her, and that I didn't know, was that in the old days, female cattle also had horns. And so for a long time, we associated horns, especially a horned bull, with males. So we thought, oh, of course, there must be some kind of male association, and bulls are a representation of males. But her work suggests that actually female cattle also had long horns. And so then that poses this question of perhaps the cattle idea or the horns idea is more the domain of female goddesses of the wild. Perhaps there's a connection there, and then they're connected to the antlered goddesses later on, the deer goddesses. Maenads also sometimes are depicted with wearing crowns of antlers, although that's a later depiction, not a Hellenic depiction. So there seems to be something about horns that is associated with the wild and the wilderness and freedom and power.
It makes me wonder then, in that case, if maybe originally the Minotaur may have not been a bull, but a female cow. And if that's the case, what does it mean that we have this wild, rampaging, bovine, anthropomorphic beast that's being kept in a labyrinth? Maybe there's a connection there too.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, so the labyrinth during the Minoan period is a symbol of self-discovery. So you enter the the labyrinth predates the Minoans, actually, and predates many cultures. Many cultures have a labyrinth in them. across the world, some kind of a labyrinth in them. And the labyrinth originally is a source of self-discovery. So you're supposed to enter the labyrinth and face yourself and face your dark self and face all these things. And by the time you come out or you reach the end, you have been changed. So it's the labyrinth is a metaphor for the journey of self-discovery. Then later on, it takes on a journey of like going into the underworld and coming back up. There's lots of stories. The labyrinth really fascinates lots of cultures. And for the Minotaur, the labyrinth becomes the place where he's lost in because he can't make himself come out. So the very fact that these two symbols, and these symbols are of the goddess. So the horns are of the goddess. They're called the consecrated horns. And the labyrinth is a symbol of the goddess. The fact that they then become, according to the Greeks, systems of a prison and a monster really tells us the way that they created this propaganda for themselves, that Theseus, through the betrayal of Ariadne, of her family, Theseus conquers both the labyrinth and the Minotaur. I mean, it's quite convincing and convenient. And it really shows Athenian prowess, right? Athenian power, overcoming. And so if we think about it in the terms that these two were symbols of goddesses, it's very clearly a patriarchal symbol of overcoming the symbols of ancient goddesses. And because Ariadne supposedly falls in love with Theseus, so in love that she betrays her family, this would have been expected among Greeks because, of course, women are softer and fall prey to love, right? So there's a lot of political propaganda that I think went on in that. The thing that's really interesting is that by the time the Greeks arrive in Crete, the Minoan culture is sort of coming down. So it's beginning to deteriorate. So actually the Greeks themselves don't know what a lot of the places in Crete, for example, represent. They don't know. It's rumors, right? And what's leftovers. But they were not there at the peak of the Minoan civilization. And so, again, an interesting conversations we're beginning to have now, which I think are really relevant. And a lot of people are interested in Minoan civilizations and the labyrinth. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, the final point is it also, this connection between goddesses and horns also reminded me of I think it's a Neolithic. Or as earlier, it's a piece of mobiliary art. It's basically a kind of a flat rock that has a bas relief of a goddess holding a bull's horn.
That's the Venus of Lazel, yeah?
Yeah, in her hand. So that may come into play somewhere, maybe.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I have seen there's a debate on what she's holding. Some people say she's holding a crescent moon, and some people say she's holding a horn. If we think about the fact that bovine females may have had horns, because apparently this is a scientific fact, then that has implications as far as, is she holding the key to agricultural wealth, fertility wealth, the cosmos? That piece is significant because it's so ancient, archaic, almost Paleolithic, it's like so far back. And so, but what's really significant about that is that it seems that association continued for 10,000 years or 8,000 years and made its way even into the Mediterranean. But then slowly we see that the association becomes masculine with horns. And of course, if we go through Christianity, horns become satanic. I did an episode on the horned goddess because I was really irked that everywhere I turned to see horns, it was all about devil worship and goat worship. And I thought, okay, we need to talk about horns, people, poor Pan, they take Pan with the horns on his head and they make him into the devil. And I always tell my students, like, the devil's not real. It's fiction. It's fan fiction. People make that shit up. They made that shit up. Sorry for swearing on your episode, but they made it up, and they sort of amalgamated all these gods into this being and went, oh, look at this thing, be afraid of this thing, it's really scary. And so horns, I think, have always been a symbol of power and fertility and wealth and all these things, and wildness. for sure. And perhaps that makes sense that now they've turned it into a symbol of evil because it's scary, right? It's scary to the status quo. But I see that a lot of women, especially in goddess circles, are taking back that. I don't know if you guys also know that reindeer, that Santa's reindeer are all female. So when I did that horned goddess episode, I looked up, horned goddesses. And one of the things that I didn't know for a long time was that female reindeer and male reindeers all have horns or antlers. And that the males shed them in like September, and only the females have them on in winter, in like the winter months. And so all of Santa's reindeer then technically are female reindeer, which I thought was like, there's a lot that we don't know that has been politically defined for us, and perhaps spiritually defined for us. I don't know, that we are talking about now, which is really, I think, exciting. We're living in good times.
One extra point: the bovine species that is the ancestor of modern cow species is called the aurochs, and yeah, it had horns among both sexes, but also there are still cows that have horns among both sexes, like the Highland cow and even Texas Longhorn cows.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't know anything about that before I started digging into this horn thing. I didn't even realize that. And then I've also read that they shave down the horns of cows too, and that I had no idea. So but that really shifts, I think, our mentality, because for a long time we're taught that horns represent male bulls, and that represents power, and right. And now you're like, wait, females have horns and antlers too, and you're like, whoa, what does this mean? So I think it's really exciting to know that. Yeah.
I want to go back to this connection between the Venus of Lazel, because I was going to bring that up to point to the Kore statue, the Kore-Artemis Artemis in the Acropolis Museum. There's a point that I'm exploring too, parallel to your own research in the field in Mesopotamian research and the goddess Inanna. And I'm like pretty certain now, I'm like so clear that the descent of Inanna was actually a puberty ritual for little girls to step into their womanhood. So I will be arguing that. And so, there's this idea of 13, going back to that Kore statue and the bullhorn or bison horn in the Lazel with the 13 marks on it. And one of the questions is this the lunar cycle? Is this a calendar marking the lunar cycle in relationship to the menstrual cycle? And so that was my thought when I looked at the Kore statue, was maybe that's the lunar cycle. And because it's a Kore, a little girl or a young woman, right? There might be a relationship between menstrual rites or puberty ritual, puberty rites, girlhood into womanhood, and that celestial human connection.
Yeah, I love that. And it's funny because we were just talking about going down rabbit holes. Yesterday, I went through this whole thing about turtles and was watching people who were talking about how turtles have the 28 days and then the 13 months on their back, and how indigenous traditions in North America knew this, and that the original calendar was 13 months anyways. So there's this whole work that's being done that talks about the fact that our natural calendar is 13 months, because if we count 28 days a year, you end up with 13 months. And so that's really fascinating. And it would not surprise me at all that there is something here. And of course, there's no accident that young girls would get their menstruation in that 12th, 13th year, depending, right? But that they could have that ritual anytime, let's say before your 13th year. I mean, it's one of the frustrating things is that women in temples and priestesses and women worshipers never wrote anything down. As women, we tend to share everything orally anyways. Plus, a lot of it is like secret knowledge, just mysterious knowledge, just personal body knowledge. We tend to carry knowledge in our bodies. And so because of that, as a scholar, it's very difficult to dig through men's interpretation of what women do.
Yep.
And so that has been my lot, and it's probably going to be all of your lots moving forward. And so so the only thing we really have though is material culture, like artifacts. But Maria Gimbutas was struggling 30, 40 years ago trying to just say something very simple, and she had done so much incredible work. And even when I was getting my PhD, they were like, oh, we don't bring Marianga Buddhists into your work. Like, we don't want to go there. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is good academic work. Just because you don't like it, okay, or you don't agree with it, you can say that. But so we have a lot to overcome. And that's actually been my goal. And one of the reasons why I'm focusing more on women and I guess men who come to the foray, but women who are, because I feel like, what is the point of all this work if we don't apply it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, yeah, okay, I can have academic accolades, that's great, but I'm not interested in that. I would really like the work to be like living work in practice. And so I'm doing some workshops and stuff like that. I'm trying to make it like live. Like, how do we use this in women's lives? And one of the things that has really come up for the women that I've been talking to is they would like to have some more public initiation rituals. That might be one of the ways in which we can begin tapping into that ancestral knowledge. And I mean, I don't know what that will look like, but I'd like to play in that field with them and create, because we don't have, we never wrote anything down, and so then these guys came in and kind of, I don't know if, I don't want to say it's malicious, but it's an interpretation, so you got to take that with a grain of salt.
It's a different show and value systems.
Yeah.
Knowledge is valued and experiences are valued.
Yeah.
It makes me think of sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Anna. I was just thinking of the Artemis, like the wooden stake or wooden statue that may have been faceless at some point. It was literally just a stick that was bathed in blood. And was it bathed in bull's blood, or could it have been like menstrual blood?
Ooh.
Did it have to be like super violent?
I mean, I think, I don't know if the world is ready for that. I sometimes try to talk about but it wouldn't surprise me, because the ancients were grouping them all, but weren't as like icky about things, and understood the role of magic, right, in a different way than the way we think about it, and the body and different organic matter. There is in one of the Spartan rituals to Artemis, the young men who kind of walk around this wooden statue whip themselves into a frenzy until they bleed all over the statue. Wow. And the last man standing that doesn't pass out gets some kind of an accolade. So it wouldn't surprise me that and ritual blood could be really any ritual blood. And it also wouldn't surprise me that women probably wouldn't write about that. There are a lot of mysterious practices that we don't know about.
I'd like to say something to that. So Helen M. King wrote a great book called Hippocrates Women, and she theorizes like ancient Greeks' attitudes towards menstruation because they don't have any known taboo rituals. And so in her central thesis is basically that in the same way that animal blood was spilt on the altar to appease the gods and maintain the kind of congruence, the maintenance of society, of human society and divine realm, women's blood was also women's menstrual blood was a sacrificial thing that they did to maintain civilization, to keep civilization going. So it's a really, really compelling and interesting theory.
Yeah. I've heard theories that in tribal cultures, so pre all of these cultures, that there were tribes or peoples who would collect moon blood, like they call it, and they would dip their swords or arrows in the blood for power, that they thought it was powerful blood. And then there are stories where they would paint themselves with this blood as sort of magic is the only word that comes to mind, but that it would have this power, this mysterious aspect to it. And I think I fell down that rabbit hole when I read the Red Tent, and all of right, the red and all of the aspects of that sort of tradition. But yeah, that there might have been cultures that saw the moon blood as powerful, not like any other kind of bleeding, right? Because it comes from this interesting source. And today we go, well, I know how menstruation works, but it's still quite miraculous that we bleed for 7 days and don't die. I mean, I get there's a scientific explanation, but that doesn't make it any less awesome and unique, to half of the world population or more, whoever bleeds menstrually is performing kind of a magic. Yeah, you know, it is. So I find that really fascinating, and how we become dismissive of it. Or like, oh yeah. Or young women today, like I have a daughter, my daughter's 24 years old, and every time she's during that time of the month, she's like, I hate this. And I'm like, this is a privilege. This is, you know, you're magical. This is the magic of your body. And she's always like, oh my God. She's not yet a fan of the magic of her body. But, you know, when she first got her period, for example, because in my family, we do little initiation rites in our own family. I did a whole party with her, and I bought her this red thing, and we did this whole thing. And like, it was a time of happiness and initiation, you know, and I would like to have something that would be more public or group, maybe not public, but communal. Communal is probably the right word. So
me too. That's something that I'm working on in my work as well. So maybe there's more to be discussed later on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or pathways that anyone else wants to go down?
I do have one, but it might open too much of a rabbit hole and too long of a tangent that we're probably running out of time. I just keep thinking about the idea of sort of reinstating the Arkteia in some way, shape, or form for contemporary times as a rite of passage for women. But one thing that really strikes me is, how do we include non-cis women, trans women, or even just like non-binary people who to goddess worship?
You know, that's a great question. I believe, I don't know. Okay, I'm going to say I believe, because there's no evidence for this, but I believe that in the ancient world, there were non-binary people who were welcomed in whatever event or ritual, festival, that in the way that they identified. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to use modern language for ancient thought, in the sense that people were allowed to present as they wanted. There isn't any language. When we get to the Romans, there's a little bit of language, but there isn't any language that is as violent and as isolating and devastating as there is language for in our vocabulary today for trans people, right? And so it makes me think that though there is language around people that lived as women, let's say, because men are writing, so there's a lot of language around there were men that lived like women, not so much language around women that lived as men. That's interesting, but who knows? I mean, the Greeks had their own thing. And so I think if we do an initiation ritual in this way, yeah, we will have to include anyone that lives as a woman. I mean, to me, if you live as or you live however you live, if you live as a man, if you live as a woman, you have the right to show up to the festivals and rituals in which are in that umbrella of the way that you live, right? And so we would have to accommodate that in some way. I'm not sure that would be difficult, because there's nothing inherently biological about the Arkteia, in the sense that you are dancing around the altar, you are dropping your saffron, let's say, dress, and you are entering this next phase of life. So technically, you know, that's how you identify, and that's something that you feel it comes natural to you and to participate in. There should be nothing in the way of that. You know what I mean? In the sense that there's nothing that you have to show or prove biologically in order to be part of that. I think that's a modern concern. If I ran an Arkteia at my Artemis temple, I would not even like, it would be whoever identifies with this festival. You know, I think the challenge comes as far as like safe spaces, making sure that it's a safe space and making sure that everyone participating understands that this is a safe space for everyone. That sometimes is something you have to kind of go into. But as far as the goddess or the ritual mythology, I don't think that there's any reason to, you know.
I think there was like a whole controversy at like a Paganicon or whatever the term is, maybe even a decade ago, where a lot of people were feeling alienated and ostracized by that particular branch of witchcraft. And I don't want to like completely throw Dianic Wicca under the bus. I'm sure it has many valuable components, but it just seems like there is kind of a history within the contemporary mind of using Artemis / Diana as a means of silencing women who are not cisgendered.
I
or
see.
like demonizing and othering them.
I see. Well, that's unfortunate. I do think that there may be some, and I don't know for sure, but there may be some resistance. I sometimes hear talking of like, we would like to have a women's space, and this women's space is defined biologically, which I sometimes go, I mean, so, and I think, I don't want to throw people under the bus, but I think this is a bit generational sometimes. I think that some generations fought very hard for women's spaces, and now they feel like, oh, we must have to give up these women's spaces as well. But I think that there may be some type of, I want to say, a bit of ignorance or misunderstanding, in the sense of like, anyone that identifies in that way, and then the female way or whatever, or is non-biologically female, still experiencing female life, like, to me, right? So therefore, if you're going to experience female life, you must be able to experience female festivals and female like. So I hope that it's something that is being changed. Yeah, I think you bring up. I didn't actually associate too much of that Artemis and Diana association, which I don't like. Like, okay, I got to make sure that this is not going to be the case for Artemis, because I actually think that Artemis is the most female defensive. I mean, and by that I mean that she's surrounded by women and works for women and protects women. And so I would like to think that anyone that identifies as a woman and comes into a women's circle feels that protection and that safety. That's what I mean. And so that might be something I'll have to like pay a little closer attention to, because I take it for granted that that's the case, but you may be right. It may not be the case everywhere. Yeah.
I mean, what I was going to say is that, like, in Hinduism, you have everybody worships the gods and the goddesses.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part of the course. And, in ancient Mesopotamia, for example, usually it was like a priestess would have been a priestess to a god and vice versa.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of I don't know as much about particular rituals, like puberty rituals, for example, what the participation would have been like. But generally speaking, I think this for me feels like a question that's very particular to Judaic Christian cultures, where we have become so enculturated to just be worshiping a male god. You know what I mean? So it's I was thinking about this recently, so different when you think about how it's normal for other people to be like, hey, there's God and goddess, or gods and goddesses. Or maybe we're not quite sure. Maybe they're a little bit of both. And so I feel like this is really a good question for us who grew up in a culture with just the singular male divinity.
Yeah. And to speak on like even things like Dionysus is gender fluid. And I always saw Artemis as what we used to call a tomboy. And so I see her a bit as like pushing the envelopes of what would have been appropriate for the Greeks at the time for a woman. Like, she wears the short skirt, she runs in the woods, she climbs trees, So I think that there's more to these divinities than we have been led to believe. They've been really categorized and put into little boxes. And now I hope that we're revealing more, like, look, there's lots of room the spectrum is wide. There's lots of room. So I'm hoping that we're doing that, but it's a work in progress, I guess, clearly.
It makes me think of Dionysus, like anyone and everyone, regardless of how they identify gender-wise, is welcome to the Maenad party.
That's right. Yes. We should bring that back. That has to come back.
That's right.
Wild parties, that has to come back. And in the safety, one of the things that women, or anyone who identifies that way, don't have is a space to be wild.
Yeah.
Like, when was the last time we did that? I mean, I heard recently that there are clubs that are for women only. or I guess whoever, identifies as women. And somebody was saying, oh, these clubs are never going to do well. And they're saying that they're like sold out, packed. And I thought, like, this is a really modern way. This is a Maenad party in a way, because you can go there with all your friends and party, and you don't have to worry about like that machismo dude coming in to like, and you don't have to worry about safety. You might not even have to worry about your drink. Like, oh, what? So nobody puts something in your, And so I'm not surprised that they're super popular and they pop up in places. And I thought, but there was a lot of backlash from some of the men that were like, oh, so you don't want us at your party? And I'm like, I would love to have a party where there's no dudes. Just the safety of that. And, whoever's in there, however they identify, whatever their, it's like all, it's that safety, I think. And the partying, of course. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's part of the future. I don't know. It's not in the woods. It's in a club, but it's a beginning.
That's right. Ross, did you have anything else you wanted to ask?
I was thinking in terms of figures of wildness. Like the only other, at least in terms of Greek mythology, figure that I can think of that was a woman but was allowed to express and live that wildness was Atalanta.
Yep. Yes.
But even then, that was only generally either within the confines of her father's kingdom, after she'd been, abandoned, or while she was in the company of men while she was an Argonaut.
Yes. Yeah. I'm 100% certain that there were a lot of wild women, and there were a lot of athletic women, and there were a lot of hunter women. There are, for Artemis especially, there are a lot of rituals in which women race, and they do sports in some way. So, but you're absolutely right. There are not too many figures that have survived that are examples of how that took place. I mean, the Spartan women are sort of one of the aspects that we look to. Atalanta is one as well. But still, that's very few. And that's sort of the historical, I don't know, blindness of perhaps women, maybe not the Athenian women because they were quite closeted, but other women had all kinds of, or perhaps even the Athenian women inside their home, had much more room to do activities, but then didn't write about it because it wasn't part of what was accepted. So yeah, I think no one has beat the wildness or taken the wildness or killed the wildness out of us. But we've been made afraid to be wild. Of course, the witch hunts of Europe also question, oh, what are all these older women doing alone in the woods in their homes? So I think we have been afraid to practice it. And so I'm hoping the movement for me with Artemis is bringing back that wildness to us, right, in whatever form we can, slowly, and then eventually maybe full on, just be who you are. And,
really like reclaiming her, because I don't want to go too much on a tangent here, but I rereading this book by a feminist Assyriologist, and she's like, listen, people, the Mesopotamian goddesses, they're not role models. They were there to reinstate gender stereotypes and roles. Even Inanna, by thwarting it, she reinforced it. And I was really seeing that in Artemis too. I was like, I think there's like this crazy, wild, pre-Artemis Artemis, but then it's like once she became classical, it seems like she's there to help civilize. She's
That's right.
A civilizing force.
That's right.
Like, that's what's so maddening about it, because her feminine wildness is used against women.
That's right. 100%. You're right. That's my thing with that Arkteia as well, is that they're giving up that wildness. They're submitting it to Artemis. And it irks me like a lot. It irks me. And it's definitely a patriarchal system in place. I mean, it is what it is. And it's interesting that in a way, sometimes I think, so did they have to perform it in order to be eligible to be married? Like, so did they have to publicly give up the wildness before they were entered into the pool of marriageable women? And certainly Euripides and Aeschylus think so in their plays. So again, we're getting a really biased I don't know, what did they do at these temples?
Right.
They spent a lot of time and money, and there's a lot of time that priestesses were alone. Young women would live there sometimes for years, like, you know, but we don't have any evidence. So yeah, I agree with you.
Maddening.
Yes.
Is there anything else, any other juicy tidbits or burning something inside of you that anyone wants to say?
As we're talking about socially acceptable wildness that's packaged to reinforce gender roles, I was also thinking about how the Athenians had, was it a one-day festival where women and men switched roles, and the women could go to the forum and go to market and could pass laws and discuss philosophy in public, and the men had to do everything. And then at some other point in the year, there was another sort of opposite day kind of thing where it was slaves and masters switch roles and that sort of thing, to act as sort of a pressure release or a pressure valve to keep a lid on everything, so that they'd have they'd be tossed a bone to look forward to and the next year, so they wouldn't, there wouldn't be any civil unrest.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that you say that, Ross, it reminds me, actually, we could probably do a whole other episode on the secrets of priestesses, because it reminds me of all of the secrecy around the way that priestesses practice things like prophecy, oracle work, cleansing of statues. And I think you're right in the sense that valve, that pressure cooker valve, it happens, of course, when you keep any people under like the sort of dominant, you keep them submissive, or and so I think you're absolutely right that they gave them some room to like expand their wildness. But it would be lovely to also know what it was like to be an Athenian woman, or any woman at that time, and what was it, because a lot of people talk about Athenian women today. Like if you go to Greece, Greek women are very well known for not being submissive, and and so sometimes I wonder, I mean, I know there's a lot of politics over the land and who came in from where, and there's, so we can't say it's a direct descendant of Athenian women. But if you think about women across the world, right? Like people go, oh, these kinds of women are more submissive, and then you actually go and get to know women from different cultures, and you go, I have yet to see women that are truly like, that submissive. And so I think a lot of it had to be performance for our own safety. And so I would be curious as to what happened behind those doors in those temples in the ancient world. That would be amazing.
Yeah. It's like a cliffhanger.
That's right.
Great place.
That's right.
Oh, all right, everyone. I'm going to give an outro. I'm going to thank you, each and every one of you, for being here. This was so fabulous. Everybody go out and buy Dr. Carla's book called She Who Hunts. Go buy it. And you have a few other publications out, don't you?
I have like a couple of papers and stuff. You could probably Google them and download them. Yeah.
Okay. I'll leave in the show notes, the YouTube text box, Dr. Carla's information and a link to buy her book. And also Dr. Courtney, I'll leave a link to your Goddess Center. And Roz, you're very not social media, so I probably won't leave any links for you.
I'm good with that.
Yeah. So to everybody at home, thank you for being here. Once again, please like, please share, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. And everybody at home, thank you. Until next time. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.